Hey, what's good, everybody? Uh, Thank you all for joining me for a brand new video. So today's video, we're gonna be going through my CD collection of the legendary, iconic death metal band known as Simply Def. And Def, they were a Florida death metal band which was founded and led by the late Chuck Schuldiner. And the band formed in 1984. I believe they were known as Mantis at that time. I don't know exactly when the band changed, when Chuck changed the band's name to Def, but they were a highly influential band within not only the Florida death metal scene, but just death metal in general. When they came on the scene, so many bands were influenced by them, and I mean they were just a wonderful band. I mean, they started out as more of a typical, very brutal, aggressive death metal band, but with each album and with different lineup changes, and as well as leader Chuck Schuldiner's musical expansion, man. He started to evolve musically as a musician and a songwriter. The band started to go in more progressive or technical death metal territories, which by the time the band ended, in their final album, you could honestly say that they were a progressive metal band. And Chuck he ended up, disbanding Def and forming a power progressive metal band known as Control Denied. But unfortunately, Chuck, he passed away in 2001 from cancer. Before any of that could be further realized, they did put out one album called The Fragile Art of Existence, but which is a great record. Highly recommend you go check that out as well. But yeah, we're just gonna I'm just gonna go through my CDs because I have all their albums on CD, and it's a short discography. It's only 7 albums, but it's a great discography. And I'm just gonna go ahead. I'm gonna go out on a limb and just tell you right now that this band had no bad albums. Def had no bad albums in their discography. I mean, every record they put out was solid. There might be some you like better than others, but honestly, they didn't put out a bad record. So let's go ahead and get this started. Let's start with the first album right here, which is Scream Bloody Gore, which was released in 1987 on Combat Records. This is the debut album, and yeah, this is the reissue that Relapse Records put out about several years ago. Comes with 2 discs, a bonus disc with like rehearsals, demos, and some extensive liner notes and pictures. People telling stories and stuff about things that were happening around this time. And I didn't know this until I watched the documentary on Def called Def by Metal. But this album was only recorded with 2 members. That was Chuck Schuldiner and drummer Chris Reifert. Yeah, and Chuck recorded this album out in California. I think he actually moved out to the Bay Area because this is when the Bay Area thrash metal scene was really taking off. And I think he was living out in Antioch, California. And I don't remember exactly where he met Chris Reifert, but Chris Reifert joined on drums. I think Chris had heard about him through the tape trading network that was happening back in those days. And they recorded a demo and everything for the album. But yeah, it was only him. Chuck, he did the guitars, he did the bass, and of course the vocals, and Chris Reifert did the drums. And I gotta tell you, man, it's a heavy record, man. It's a very punishing and pummeling death metal album. It's typical death metal. You just look at the cover, and it's titled Scream Bloody Gore, and then you got these titles called Torn to Pieces, Legion of Doom, the title track Scream Bloody Gore, Sacrificial, Mutilation, Land of No Return, Baptized in Blood. Wait a minute, I'm sorry, sorry about that, I'm looking at the wrong track listing. That's for this too. You got songs like Infernal Death, Zombie Ritual, yeah, Sacrificial Mutilation, Regurgitated Guts, let's see here, Baptized in Blood, Torn to Pieces, Evil Dead, Land of No Return. Yeah, just by judging by those titles, you can already tell that this is all about blood, guts, and gore, man. It's pretty typical of death metal. But this was a groundbreaking record. It was a groundbreaking album. You could argue that this was the first death metal album. Some might say, or there might, well, maybe not some, but others may say, Possessed Seven Churches, which came out in 1985. So there's a huge argument. There's an argument there. Possessed is a Bay Area death metal band, but I think Scream Bloody Gore was the album that really kicked off the movement. I think that was the record where a lot of people started paying attention to this new extreme form of metal that was coming out. And you can correct me if I'm wrong, but at this point, I think before Scream Bloody Gore came out, and even Possessed Seven Churches, I think the heaviest thing that was out was probably Slayer's Reign in Blood. You can correct me if I'm wrong, because this came out. These records came out before I was even born. I was born 2 years later, so I don't know, man. But I've heard a lot of people say that this album was like, it just blew them away, because they ain't never heard something as intense and as brutal and as heavy as this record, man. But it was a groundbreaking record. So many bands were influenced by it. It helped to develop other genres of extreme metal. I think the second wave of black metal was influenced by Scream Bloody Gore. It was just a groundbreaking record for its time, man. And I'm not too much of a huge fan of the early death stuff, because it was more like typical death metal. But one thing I can say is, in spite of it, the band was tight. I mean, they were technically proficient compared to other death metal bands at this time, man. But I think it was amazing that, this record was only done by two people, because Chris Reifer said in the interview, as a matter of fact, on the Death by Metal documentary, that him and Chuck had a hard time trying to find other players. So him and Chuck just did the album together, and it's an amazing debut album, and I can see why it was such a groundbreaking record when it was released, man. But yeah, Scream Bloody Gore, that's the debut album from Death. Alright, so now we're gonna go to the next album on here, which is Leprosy, released in 1988. Yeah, released in 1988. And yeah, this is the Relapse version. I don't have any OG pressings of these albums. It'd be nice to have some, but yeah, these are the Relapse Records reissues. So Leprosy, man, honestly, I think it keeps with the same formula that Scream Bloody Gore had, but I will say that I think the production on this album was a bit better, because this time around, Scott Burns, who is a well-known engineer, producer, who worked for Morris Sound Studios down in Tampa, Florida, which is, the whole Tampa, the Florida death metal scene. And I don't know if I mentioned in my intro, but this is where Death is from. Death is from the Florida. They were one of the pioneering bands, or you could say they were the band that kick-started the whole Florida death metal scene out there. I don't know if I mentioned that in my intro. But yeah, they recorded this album. This album was recorded at Morris Sound Recording Studios in Tampa, Florida. And Scott Burns, he did the mixing, so the record sounds better. Production-wise, it's more of an improvement over Scream Bloody Gore. And honestly, I can say that you can start to kind of hear a little bit of the intricate playing on this record, in my opinion. I mean, for the most part, it's still a pummeling, punishing death metal record like the first album, but I'm starting to hear, as I went back and was re-listening to this album, I was starting to hear a little bit of kind of intricate or technical parts in some of the songs, man. And this is a different lineup. Joining Chuck is Rick Rozz on lead guitar, Bill Andrews on drums. Terry Butler is credited with bass, but he didn't actually play on the album. Chuck played the bass on this album as well. And I remember I remember watching the Death by Metal documentary. Terry Butler was talking about that, and I don't know, he got really nervous when they went into the studio to start recording the record, and he like had a panic attack in the studio when it was time for them to record. So he just asked Chuck if he was just do the bass parts or whatever, and Chuck was like, yeah, man, I don't mind doing it. But yeah, he's credited, but he didn't actually play on this album. But yeah, for the most part, man, it pretty much sticks to the same formula as, the previous record. It's just that I think it's a bit of an improvement as far as like the production and even in the songwriting. And plus, it's more of an actual band instead of just two people. So, but yeah, Leprosy is a good album. It's a classic in the death metal. In the death metal scene, in metal in general, in extreme metal in general, man. It's a great record, man. I think I like it a bit better than Scream Bloody Gore. It just seems to be somewhat of a slight improvement over that record. But yeah, I enjoy it a lot, man, and definitely an album worth checking out if you haven't. But yeah, that's Leprosy, released in 1988. Cool, real cool cover. And oh yeah, all these covers were being illustrated by renowned artist Ed Repka. Ed Repka, he was known for like doing a lot of artwork for thrash metal bands and stuff too, as well as death metal bands. But yeah, Ed Repka, he did this cover as well as Scream Bloody Gore. But really cool cover, I think. Alright, so next album is Spiritual Healing, released in 1990. And you know something, a lot of people tend to think that a lot of people tend to say that this is one of Def's weakest albums. Especially when you compare it to the first three albums. Most people label this one as the weakest one. Me personally, I actually like this one a lot more than I do the previous two records. And here's the reason why, because Spiritual Healing was actually a transitional record for Def, because with this album, Chuck, he decided to abandon the whole blood, gore, and horror theme subject matter, and he actually started to talk about real subjects. Instead of talking about horror movie themes, he started talking about like the horrors of society, like things that were more relatable to people. So a lot of things he addressed on this album was abortion, genetics, and televangelism, which you can see by the cover. The cover art really exemplifies that. Televangelism was something that was a huge topic for a lot of extreme metal bands back then, especially in death metal and thrash metal. But yeah, this album right here, man, this is where you're starting to see the change. And this is where the band is starting to become more of what I'm more of a fan of. It's still for the most part a very heavy and aggressive death metal record, but it's starting to get a lot more technical with this album. It's starting to get a lot more technical. Even the songs on here are a bit longer. On here, the longest song on here is 7 minutes and 44 seconds. Most of the songs clock in at around 5 minutes or 5.5 minutes. Yeah, the songs on here are a little bit longer on here. And let's see, what's the lineup on this one? Okay, the lineup on this one, along with Chuck, is James Murphy on guitar, Terry Butler, and Bill Andrews, on drums. So pretty much the same lineup, except Rick Rozz isn't on this album. Rick Rozz isn't on this album. And you can watch the Death by Metal documentary. That gives you more details on the lineup changes and all that. But yeah, man, a really great album. I think out of the first three records, this is the one that I like the most. Because, it wasn't the typical death metal, blood, guts, and gore like most bands were doing. Chuck was really talking about real subjects that people could actually relate to. That's what I like about it. And the more technical side of the band was really starting to come into play as well. That's why I really like this record. But to each his own. Some people like it, some people don't. But I don't think it's the weakest out of the first three. I think it's the best, honestly, out of the first three. But a lot of great songs on here, man. Like Living Monstrosity, Altering the Future, the title track, Spiritual Healing, Genetic Reconstruction, Within the Mind. I mean, it's only 8 songs, man, but every last one of these songs are really good, man. Every last one of these songs are really good. And also Chuck's vocals, the first 2 albums, he had more of that brutal, like kind of evil growl, and his growl is starting to change here. It's starting to become more balanced. It's not too high and it's not too low. It's like a right middle. What was said in the documentary, the right middle ground. It's starting to really come into its own. His vocal is really starting to come into its own at this point. All right, so moving along, and this was also the last cover that Ed Repka did for a Def album. This was the last album cover that Ed Repka did. All right, so moving on, we get to the next record, which is Human. Human, released in 1991. Now, this record right here, I think this is where Def really became Def. This is a technical death metal album. It wasn't the first technical death metal album, because, I believe the band Atheist, I think they were one of the first technical death metal bands, and one of the first technical death metal bands to put out an album. I think they predated that style before Def did. And actually, I think they were actually an influence on the band Def, as well as Cynic. Cynic was another Florida death metal band who played in the technical death metal style. And fun fact, 2 members of the band Cynic actually played on this record, and that's Paul Masvidal and Sean Reiner. And RIP to Sean Reiner. He actually passed away last year. He passed away last year. I think maybe around February or so last year, if I'm not mistaken. But yeah, both of those guys played on this record. Sean Reiner played on drums, and Paul Masvidal, he played on the guitars. And Steve DiGiorgio, actually, this was the first album he played on. This was the first album he played on. And Steve DiGiorgio actually played in a band called Sadist. Yeah, he played in a band called Sadist back in the day. And him and Chuck actually had a long relationship dating back to the early days, like when Chuck was out in California and was trying to get things started and was recording demos with Chris Reifert and stuff like that. Him and Steve DiGiorgio had a long relationship, man, but prior to the Human album. But this was the first album that he actually played on. He plays bass, and I gotta tell you, man, this is a great album. This is a great album. I really enjoy listening to this record, man. They definitely took death metal to different territories with this record. They really showed that there was more to death metal than what was popular at the time. Because I think at this point in 1991, when this record came out, death metal had gotten a little bit redundant because everybody was trying to out extreme each other. But nah, Def just took it to a whole nother level, man. And I mean, Chuck was a great musician in his own right. He was a great guitar player and songwriter, man. But he always surrounded himself with great musicians. I compare him to Dave Mustaine of Megadeth, because Dave Mustaine is a great musician and songwriter, man. Megadeth has went through countless lineup changes, but Dave has always surrounded himself with great musicians. And the same can be said for Chuck, man. Chuck always had great musicians behind him. The way that they take the jazz fusion influences and they just blend it with the extremity of death metal. It's just so amazing what they do, man. Steve DiGiorgio, man. I know in this remastered version, man, his bass is just so awesome. I mean, you can definitely tell that guy is a jazz is a jazz fan. You can definitely tell that he studied jazz, cause his bass licks get so jazzy, man. But it's so heavy and raw and extreme. Like, man, this is just a wonderful record, man. I mean, and so many people, man, like in the documentary, so many people in the documentary were talking about how this record was just so different from the typical death metal albums. I mean, everything from the cover art. You know, the cover art has this very artsy, like cerebral style. Not too many people in death metal or extreme metal in general were really doing that, man. They weren't doing cover arts like this. And then people talk about the song titles such as Flattening of Emotions, Together as One, Lack of Comprehension, which was one of the big singles from this. I think that was Death's first video too, as well. See Through Dreams, Cosmic Sea. Come on, man. How many extreme metal bands you know got song titles like that, man? You already know that. And even with the album title itself, Human, you already know that these guys are on something different. And they were, man. I mean, this album is amazing, man. This is an amazing album. It's one of my favorite Death albums. And as you can tell by the way I'm talking, this was the beginning of, like, this is my favorite era of Death right here. Because death metal really isn't one of my favorite genres. There's certain bands within it that I like, but it's not one of my favorite genres, because I always felt that it was a bit redundant and that everybody was just always trying to be out, like, kind of, like I said earlier, out extreme each other. But Death just went against the grain and did what they did, and this album was proof of it, man. I mean, the technicality, the proficiency, man, like those jazzy parts that they fuse with extreme metal and those like blast beats, and oh man, it's just an amazing record, man. And the subject matter is gone even further. You know, the subject matter is very like philosophical. So Chuck took it in a whole nother direction with the subject matter as well, man. And yeah, I could go on and on about this record, man. So I'm gonna hurry up and try to move on, but it's just an amazing album, man. It's a remarkable record. It's a remarkable record, and that's all that can really be said about it. It's just wonderful, man. So all right, let's move on to the next one, because I don't want to spend all day talking about one record, but we're gonna go to Individual Thought Patterns, released in 1993. Oh yeah, and the previous album, Human, and this one were both released on Relativity Records. But yeah, Individual Thought Patterns, released in 1993. Another dope album. Honestly, man, I think that this right here, I think this is actually probably my favorite Death album. I went back and was listening to all these records, in order to do this video, and this is the one that I find myself going back to the most, man. Is Individual Thought Patterns. All right, so let's get a little bit into this album. For the most part, the band on this record, they pretty much keep with the same formula that they started with Human. It's not the same band though. Of course, Paul Masvidal and Sean Reiner, they had their own band called Cynic. So, they went on to continue with that. Steve DiGiorgio is still in the band, but this was his second and last album as bassist. And let's see, Gene Hoglan, the great and legendary Gene Hoglan, the Atomic Clock, is on drums on this record. And Andy LaRocque, who plays in King Diamond, he was featured on here as guitars. He played the solos. He played a lot of the solos on here, along with Chuck. Yo, this is an amazing album. It's, like I said, it keeps that same technical death metal formula from the Human album, but I think what I like about Individual Thought Patterns, though, is that it's a bit heavier and a lot rawer and angrier. As a matter of fact, Death's manager, Eric Greif, he described the album as an angry record, angry lyrically, and he attributed it to his conflict with Schrodinger at the time. He doesn't go too in depth about it on the documentary, but he mentions it in his interview parts on the documentary about, him and Chuck butting heads a lot at times. But man, this is a heavy freaking record, man, but it's still technical, and still got a little bit of that jazziness. I mean, Steve DiGiorgio's bass, man, it's just crazy, man. And not Chuck, but Gene Hoglan's drumming, I mean, it's just great. I don't know about the original version, but this remastered version, man, sounds really awesome, man. I mean, the bass is prominent, the Gene's drumming is prominent, everything is, man. It's just a heavy record, man. And I like Chuck's vocal approach on this record too. I like his vocal approach on this record because to me, his vocals on here, to me, it's like a cross between the earlier Chuck from the first 3 records and where he was starting to head more vocally. It's like a cross. It's like a good blend, a good balance of the early Chuck vocals from the early records, more straightforward death metal albums, and the new direction he's taking with this new sound. But it's got that anger, it's got that emotion in it. It's just a good balance. And I mean, the musicianship on here is just awesome, man. A lot of great songs on here. Let's see, Overactive Imagination, In Human Form. Jealousy is probably my favorite on here. Trapped in a Corner is a great one. Mentally Blonde. Individual Thought Patterns is great. Of course, this has The Philosopher on it, which that video actually got played on Beavis and Butthead. Beavis and Butthead, of course, they comically panned it, but it ended up, you know how it was back in those days. If Beavis and Butthead made fun of your video, you were more than likely going to take off as a band, and that's what happened, of course, man. So shout out to Beavis and Butthead, because there's a part in the video where there's this little kid running, and they say, "Hey, there's Jeremy," like from the Pearl Jam song called Jeremy. Like, yeah, that's Jeremy. He's still running. But it's pretty. This is a really great album. And let me tell you something else that I noticed when listening to this album. Cause Chuck Schuldiner, he was really more of, even though he started out as with the band being more as a brutal death metal band, he was actually more of a fan of like power metal, or like 80s power metal. He was really a big fan of like Judas Priest and stuff of that nature. And if you listen closely to a lot of the songs on here, you can hear a lot of that creeping in. Like, don't get me wrong, this is an angry album. It's heavy. It's heavier than the previous one. But you can hear some of those more like melodic moments creeping in to the sound, especially with Andy LaRocque's guitars. His solos are just amazing. Like, that's the thing, man. The solos on this record aren't really typical of death metal. They're like totally different. Even on the previous album, Human, the solos, the guitar work and everything, they were things that weren't typical of death metal. So these are things that just really help set the band apart, man. But yeah, you can hear a lot of that, those more power metal elements that Chuck would later further elaborate on in later work. You can hear it creeping in on this album, and that's what I like about it. How he's able to bring in that melody, but also still obtain a fair amount of extremity. Just awesome, man. I just really enjoy this record, man. I mean, the melody on here mixed with the extremities, man. It's just awesome, man. This is another album that I could talk about all day, but alas, we must move on. So now we're going to go to 1995's Symbolic. Yeah. This was released in I said 1995. This came out on Roadrunner Records. This was actually the only album they released on Roadrunner. Because I think Chuck ended up having a sour relationship with that label. He was, again, with each album, Chuck was trying to move away from the death metal stigma. He was trying to move away from it. And, Roadrunner, like, kept trying to promote him as a death metal man, and it really ticked him off. But yeah, Symbolic, even more melody. Heavy record, still extreme, but even more, even more melody, at this point. So this is, for the most part, this is like a melodic death metal album. Every things have changed. This is a different lineup. This was the last album with Gene Hoglan. You got Bobby Coble on guitar and Kelly Conlon on guitar and bass. So it's a different lineup. Steve DiGiorgio, he actually did demo this album, certain tracks from this album, but he ended up not doing it because he had a kid that was being born around the time. So he wasn't able to do it. But yeah, this is like more of a melodic death metal album. Even Chuck's vocals is changing. It's not as abrasive. It's a little bit, I don't want to say softer, but it's just not as abrasive as it was in the past. But this is a great album. A lot of people list this album as Def's best record, and I mean, I wouldn't disagree with that. It's a really good record. It's a really good record. I mean, it's melodic, but it's extreme. So a lot of good songs on here. The title track, Symbolic, Zero Tolerance. Let's see, Misanthrope. It's a really good one. Perennial Quest. I really like that. That's probably my favorite on the album. Crystal Mountain. Empty Words. Empty Words. I really like the acoustic intro of that song. It's dark, but it's very beautiful. You know, I was listening to this on my way home from work today, and I had to start over that intro on Empty Words because I thought it was really beautiful. But yeah, man, this is a really great album, man. Like I said, it was the last one with Gene Hoglan, and also technically this was the last Deft album because Chuck actually disbanded Deft after this record because he was pretty much ready to move on to other things. He was ready to move on to Control Denied, to the more progressive power metal style that he was going for. But yeah, this is an awesome album, man. And yeah, you know, I don't listen to it as much as like Individual Thought Patterns or maybe Human, but I'm starting to listen to it a lot more. It's starting to become one of my favorites, man. It's a really dope record. But yeah, definitely check out Symbolic, man. Awesome record. All right, and so now we come to the last album, and that is The Sound of Perseverance, released in 1998. Yeah, this is the final album from Def, and this was actually the first Def album that I bought. This was actually the first album. When I first discovered them and was starting to get into them, this was the first one I started with. It was, I don't know, it just felt like the right one to start with. You know, I had listened to Scream Bloody Gore, but you gotta understand that was more of a purely death metal album, and I just wasn't really there yet with death metal. So I started with The Sound of Perseverance, man. And this album is very progressive, man. It's very progressive. A lot more melody. Still extreme, but yeah, just a lot more melody. And that's because this wasn't even supposed to have been a death album. Actually, it was supposed to have been a lot of the songs on this album was supposed to have been for Chuck's Control Denied band, but he had signed with Nuclear Blast Records, and they wanted one more Deft album. So him and the band, and at this point the band is you know, of course, Chuck, Shannon Hamm on guitar, Scott Clendenin on bass, and Richard Christie on drums. And so they went in and they recorded some more songs, and they released it, you know, as Def, The Sound of Perseverance. And this will be the official, like, final Def album, although it was mainly intended to be Control Denied. And it's a great album, man. Like, it's definitely more on the progressive side. Chuck's vocals are even more, I don't want to say soft or lighter, man. It's just not, they're not as abrasive as even on Symbolic. You know, they've changed. I even think the demo versions, Chuck actually sung. He actually sing sings on some of these songs. Yeah, on the demo version, if you get the remaster version with the second disc, the 96 demos, Chuck is actually singing lead on some of the songs. And, I need to check that out, man. I don't really listen to that second disc too much. Yeah, but, yeah, Chuck is actually singing lead on some of those songs. So, yeah, man, like I said, man, this is more progressive metal. But it's a really good record. I haven't listened to it in a while, because once I discovered the other albums and started listening to them, I geared more towards them. But yeah, it's a wonderful album, man. If you're somebody that's really not that into death metal and you don't know where to start, you want to kind of ease your way in, I would recommend starting with The Sound of Perseverance. I would recommend that. That's really what made me start looking at death metal differently, and it eased me into it. I'm not like a huge death metal fan, but I do have more bands that are purely death metal that I enjoy as well. But yeah, this was a gateway album for me to get to really appreciating death metal a little bit more, and it actually got me more into Death as well. The band, not the actual Death, but yeah, it got me more into the band as well. But really cool cover art too. This isn't the original cover art though. It's like a remix version. I think the original artist though, he touched up the cover though. He touched it up though. Yeah, Travis Smith, that's his name. But yeah, it's a great record, and it wasn't a bad way for the band to end. They definitely ended it on a great note. But of course, like I said, after this album, Chuck he officially disbanded Death, and he formed Control Denied, and they released one album called The Fragile Art of Existence, which I also have that on CD. I forgot to bring it out to maybe show it, but you can go look it up on Wikipedia, The Fragile Art of Existence. That's a really good album, more of a progressive power metal album, really great album. Highly recommend you check it out. But unfortunately, Chuck, he passed away in 2001 from cancer. And while he was dealing with his illness, he was also working on a second Control Denied album. I think it was called When Man and Machine Collide. And he actually wrote the songs. He actually wrote the songs and stuff. And I don't know how many songs I don't think they actually got to record any songs. I think they demoed them or something. Yeah. But there's been rumors floating around for years about possibly them finishing up the album and it being released, but those are rumors that have been floating around for a long time now. But yeah, this is my Death CD collection. It was a short discography, but it was a groundbreaking discography, one of the greatest discographies. And like I said earlier, they didn't have one bad album in their discography. Now, of course, there are some albums that I like better than the other ones. Like, I tend to like the 90s stuff that they did when they became more of a technical death metal band. I like that era more than I do, maybe the first two records where they were just a brutal death metal band. But even those records are really good. I have to be in a certain mood to really get down and listen to them. But like I said, man, just a wonderful discography, man. And R.I.P. to Chuck Schuldiner. And a big shout out to everybody that played in his band, in his different lineups, to his family that's been doing things, keeping his legacy alive, his manager, Eric Greif, everybody that had been a big part in keeping the music going and introducing, his work to a newer generation, man. Cause, I found out about this later when I was like in my late teens or whatever, man, when I started really digging into this more extreme metal stuff. But just a wonderful discography, man. And I was glad to be able to make this video. So I appreciate everybody that's watching the video. A big shout out to my new subscribers and everybody that's been supporting me, leaving comments, you know, giving me props for my videos and my content. It really motivates me to want to keep going and doing this. You know, I've been trying to do at least a video once a week. That's where I'm at with it right now. But you know, who knows? And maybe pretty soon I might start beefing it up a little bit more. Maybe drop 2 videos a week. I don't know. But I just thank everybody that support me and watching the videos. And yeah, you know, just a big shout out to everybody. If you could do me a favor, hit that thumbs up, like, share the video, and check out my other videos on my channel. I got other album ranked videos. I got CD collection videos. I got podcast episodes that I've done in the past, and tier list. Just check me out. You know, just check out the videos, and hope everybody has a blessed day and a blessed weekend. And as always, love, peace, and music. Peace out.